No dice.
Yeah, there you
How, am I just out of range?
go. Yeah, right here. I think
Okay.
point
I will. Yeah. All right. I'm not. I'm not partial to this side. So I did a little digging into trying to remember what id and ego was from, I think, college psychology or whatever class. I pulled some stuff from Dr. Sigmund Freud here. And the id is something that's present at birth. It acts according to the pleasure principle. It's the source of bodily needs and wants, emotional impulses and desires, and it's defined by the avoidance of pain. So think of a baby. The baby, as soon as it's hungry, it cries. As soon as it's wet, it cries. As soon as it's hungry, it cries. Did I say hungry already? If it's uncomfortable, if it's sleepy, whatever it is, it's feeling some sort of pain or discomfort, it immediately cries. And as we get older, hopefully, we learn how to curb that a little bit. And that's where ego comes in. So ego acts according to the reality principle. It seeks to please the id's drive in realistic ways that in the long term bring benefit rather than grief. So ego and id are still tied together, but in a more socially acceptable ways. And so it could mean one's self-esteem, an inflated sense of self-worth, the conscious thinking self, or in philosophical terms, oneself. All right. So let's talk about self-fulfillment, which is pretty ego-driven. Self-fulfillment, is it ego-driven or is it fulfilling a purpose? And some of the characteristics of ego is through self-confidence, an individual feels that by their control, he or she can cope with the problem and find new ways of dealing with struggles, to avoid struggles. And the driving force behind ego is confirmation of self-worth, self-respect, and perhaps seeking a high self-image observed internally and externally. And I'm also, when I'm talking about what I feel when I'm, like, this is not something I've read, this is something I feel when I'm egocentric. I'm thinking about my own self-worth, my own self-respect, and how am I being observed externally, and how do I feel about myself? Okay. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 1:14, we hear this, we've heard this before. I've seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. Have you guys heard of that before? All is vanity and a striving after wind. And I think about that all the time because self-fulfillment is an ongoing and difficult thing to satisfy. There's a constant unrest and impatience that accompanies this drive towards self-fulfillment. And in my opinion, it can never be satisfied because the body can never be full. It's just one thing that we consume is this quest to satisfy our own self-fulfillment. Because we're always looking for the next goal, the next acquisition, the next conquest. And I have an example of we're at point A, and we're trying to get to goal B. And once we get to goal B, our ego is quenched a little bit, right? What drove us to get to point B was this drive. It could be very selfish, or it could be purposeful. But in the case of it being selfish, I find that once you get to point B, it's short-lived before you look for the next goal or conquest or acquisition, and now point B becomes point A again. And it's a never-ending cycle. So by living this way, you never really get anywhere. That's what I've felt in my own journey. Is I got this. I'll be happy if I get this. I'll never ask you for anything else. I got it, and an hour later, I'm looking at the next thing. Okay, so in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21, there's a verse, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so we covered this a little bit. We said, since id is defined by avoidance of pain, and ego seeks to please the id's drive in realistic ways, one who is driven by ego tends to protect. The whole idea is that you build yourself an empire, right? You're trying to, this self-fulfillment is manifested in possessions, in your finances, in many things, and you then want to protect it once you've built it. So I want to now cover a couple of things with the ego that looks to avoid pain. And this is all of us. I think we all want to not be poor. None of us want to feel sorrow. None of us want to feel like a nobody. And none of us want to be hungry. And none of us want to be disrespected. Instead, we want to have wealth. We want to eat well. We want to enjoy life. And we want to be recognized and celebrated on earth. We are all going for this. So I want to now talk about Luke's coverage of the Sermon on the Mount, because we always read Matthew's, but Luke's is a little different. So the Beatitudes in Luke chapter 6, verse 20, then he lifted up his eyes toward his disciples and said, "Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you shall be filled. Blessed are you that weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake." We are familiar with that. But it goes on, and Jesus pronounces the woes. "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full, for you shall hunger. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets." It makes you think a bit about what it is that we're after and what Jesus is saying here. So does that mean we shouldn't strive on earth? That's the question. And my answer to that is no. if we're fulfilling a purpose, the ego or the self is then taken out of the equation. And we find, in many examples in the Bible, that God works through those who have the least self within them in order to carry out his will. And through them, A leads to B, and then B leads to C, and then C leads to D, and so on. But it's not about them, it's about God's will being fulfilled through them. And who can we think of that was sort of this nobody and through God became somebody? Like, who could you think of? St. Mary, yeah. St. Peter, St. Anthony, well, all of the saints, really. But the one in particular I'm thinking of is David. And so I'm going to play, I'm not going to just read it or have somebody read it. I want to play this because this psalm resonates a lot with me. And the reason for it is because of what I'm personally going through. So this is Psalm 118. And the audio doesn't work through this, but what I'll do is oops. And it's going to be this next slide's going to look like one of Marchie's, where he puts 1,000 things, 1,000 words on the screen, and no one could read any of it. But if you can, it's going to be a slow psalm where you can follow along, and hopefully you can make out the words. Hey, that's not the one. Mm-hmm.
Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, His love endures forever. Let Israel say His love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say His love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say His love endures forever. In my anguish I cried to the Lord, and He answered by setting me free. The Lord is with me, I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? The Lord is with me. He is my helper. I will look in triumph on my enemies. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. All the nations surrounded me, but in the name of the Lord I cut them off. They surrounded me on every side, but in the name of the Lord I cut them off. They swarmed around me like bees, but they died out as quickly as burning thorns. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. I was pushed back and about to fall, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. Shouts of joy and victory resound in the tents of the righteous. The Lord's right hand has done mighty things. The Lord's right hand is lifted high. The Lord's right hand has done mighty things. I will not die, but live and will proclaim what the Lord has done. The Lord has chastened me severely, but he has not given me over to death. Open for me the gates of righteousness. I will enter and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord, through which the righteous may enter. I will give you thanks, for you have answered me. You have become my salvation. The stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. O Lord, save us. O Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord we bless you. The Lord is God, and he has made his light shine upon us. With bows in hand, join in the festal procession up to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I will give you thanks. You are my God, and I will exalt you. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever.
So I used to listen to this psalm at least a dozen times every night in the hospital, and I would weep. I would cry so hard every time I would hear this psalm, because I knew the suffering that I'm going through, the pain I'm going through, there's a reason for it. And this comforted me. And then as soon as my battery in my phone died, I would then be really sad because I could no longer hear that, because I would play this until my phone died. But when you look at the actual words of this psalm, there's a pattern of giving thanks to God and not like boasting. There's nothing boastful about what he's saying. And David had a very big load to carry, and all eyes were on him. But when people saw him, they saw God. And he always gave thanks to God. And he's asking God to grant them success. So the big question I have for all of us is, let me not get ahead of myself here. Yeah. See that behind the back? So I want to start talking about suffering. And this is something I go through on a minute-by-minute basis. But I'll talk about some of the fruits of suffering. And so before my accident, I was always kind of driven. I had this drive. And where this drive was coming from a place of feeling like I was insignificant or not having much self-worth because of my childhood and the way I was brought up. And so to looking at the past, I was then trying to make up for that by being really driven. And I was always kind of thinking about myself, and once I, got this, then I was satisfied for a little bit, and then I'd move on to the next thing. And I felt like it was consuming me, like there was no end to wanting more, just to feel like, I was worth anything. And I think God saw me and God and I have a special relationship. Even before my accident, I've always felt like God was my father. And so I think what he did was he knew my heart and that I wanted him to use me for his glorification. He knew that I wanted to not take glory away from him. So what he did was he gave me my accident, which wasn't an accident in my opinion. And through this came a lot of suffering. Everything that I thought I was, like the stuff that I accomplished in my life, the things that I was very proud of even, was how I was athletic, I was outgoing, I did a lot of extracurricular things. I was a pilot, I played the drums my whole life, I was a goalie for soccer and hockey. I just was a very physical person. And I liked that about myself. And if you asked me who I was, I would tell you I'm this, 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 and this, because those are the things I did. But I can't do any of those things anymore. I'm not a physical person anymore. And so it's like, well, then who am I? So through suffering, I've learned that God was basically trying to get rid of my id and ego. He was taking the self out of me. Myself out of me, the self that was trying to feel like I wasn't trying to quench the feeling of not feeling valuable. And what he was basically telling me was, you don't need any of this, and you're valuable because you're my son. And if you deal with your suffering with grace and dignity, then the fruits of the suffering will eventually show. My father was an alcoholic, and he couldn't get a job, and so he was a very abusive man. And he didn't take his suffering with any sort of grace and dignity. He took it out on his kids and his wife and the world. He just hated everything. And I saw what that did to the house, to the family, and I decided I wasn't going to do that in my life because, again, I feel like there's got to be a purpose behind all of this. So that's why this Psalm 118 really resonates with me. I don't quite know what the purpose is yet, but I know that it's for him to decide. So I'm completely in his hands. The other thing I noticed about suffering versus success, when you're successful, you kind of show that you're successful, right? The car you drive, the house you live in, the clothes you wear, the company you keep. And sometimes there's a little competitive edge, right? This person's successful, so I'm going to try to outdo this person. I don't feel like I'm as successful, so I'm just going to distance myself from this person. It kind of causes people to almost separate, whereas I find that suffering actually unites. So when one suffers, those who have felt suffering also can relate to that person, and they come together. And it's like the example I give is if you're trying to hammer a nail on a board and you hit your thumb, all of a sudden your whole body centralizes around your thumb. You hold your thumb in the middle of your hand, or your body, and your whole body just kind of comes together to console the pain of the thumb. It doesn't, the rest of the body isn't like, well, what you need is, you need some ice, and I think you should see a specialist about that. It doesn't need to hear words or be given any sort of advice. It just needs to feel like the rest of the body understands its pain. And when I was in the hospital this last time around, I was in there for 7 weeks, and Well, the first time around, I mean, I had to have my own room because it was like a party in there. It's like people are constantly coming in and coming to see me, and it eased the pain quite a bit. There was a time where two friends who were doctors of mine, I thought they were, they understood, but, here I am. I just learned I'm not going to walk again, and they're standing over me, and they're looking at my charts. And they're like, looking at each other and trying to outdo what each other know about my charts. And, well, this could mean this. Well, yeah, this could mean that. And I took the chart and I threw it out of the door and I said, take that outside of here. I don't need to hear any of this stuff. That wasn't what I needed to hear from my friends. I didn't need to hear somebody to come and tell me, will I or won't I? I just needed to feel the embrace and the love of the body around me, the church's body. And I think that's what suffering does. And there was a time I was at my wife's grandmother's funeral at Saint or Archangel Michael, and it was a liturgy-style funeral where there was a liturgy and it's open to everyone. And I noticed this man was out in the distance, in the crowd. I knew he didn't know my wife's grandmother. And he's kind of wearing a hoodie. He's just sort of, just this unnoticed man, just an unnoticeable kind of guy. And it was communion time, and he took communion, and he came over and he starts kissing my legs. And he didn't say a word to me. He just starts kissing my legs, and he gives me a hug, and we kissed each other, and he walked away. And he said a lot of things by doing that. And he wasn't really kissing my legs. He was kissing whose legs? Christ's legs. I mean, he took a blessing. It had nothing to do with me, but because he understands suffering, and he's a sufferer. He looked at me as one who suffers, and he gave me this wordless, there were so many things exchanged between us that words could have never have described how he felt towards me and how I received it. The other thing I notice about suffering is it brings you into the moment. So let's say you have financial problems, or you have marital problems, problems with your kids. The moment you hit your thumb with that hammer, you forget everything, don't you? I mean, you're in a lot of pain, and you're fixated on that. The pain could be marital problems or problems with your child. The point is it brings you at the moment, and I've noticed that it's in the moment. That's where God is. And to live in the moment is to live eternally. So whether I'm alive on earth or I'm in spirit form, if I'm in the moment, then I live forever. Think about that for a little bit. Again, in my own experience, I always kind of looked at my past, and I didn't like it, so I always looked at the future to see how I could fix that. So I was never present. I was either in yesterday or tomorrow, and that's not where life is. If you carry your cross with grace and dignity, it prepares you for God's works. It's preparing you for something that God has in mind. One of the verses in that Psalm 118 is, "The Lord has chastened me severely, but he has not given me over to death." And the accident that I had, I should have died 10 times over. Like every doctor that came to visit me then and recently were like, "You should be dead." I mean, based on all of the numbers we're seeing, you shouldn't be alive. And I just started laughing, like, I'm not gonna die. There's a reason why I'm here. And I think for me, God's will isn't complete. Like there's going to be some fulfillment through why I'm going through what I'm going through. And then the question is, when people see you, do they see you or do they see God? You have to ask yourself that question. When you are talking with someone or, working with someone, is it your intention that they glorify you? Is it your intention that they respect you? Is it your intention that they look up to you? Or do you deflect? Do you take those things and, you redirect it towards God's glorification? That's why that Psalm 118 is, in particular, the verses that, I'll see if I can pull it up again here. And then I'll end with that since the kids are here. I mean, some of these words are just so amazing. I mean, the first few lines are just giving thanks to God. And then saying that I will not be afraid, what can man do to me? It's the suffering actually brings you a fearlessness. You then become fearless at some point. When I was in the hospital, there was a time where, this last time around, I hadn't slept for 4 or 5 days. And I was sleep deprived, and I was actually, for those who came to see me, I was unrecognizable. I was incoherent, I was hallucinating, I was nuts. And the reason for that is because I couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe for days. I was barely getting enough oxygen just to keep me alive, but I couldn't breathe. And every time I would doze off, I would wake up gasping for air. So it was days of dealing with this, and they started thinking maybe I had brain damage because of not getting, more brain damage, I guess I should say. Brain damage from not getting oxygen to my brain. So they wanted to do an MRI on me. So they shoved me in this tunnel for a couple of hours to check if I had brain damage, and I'm sleep deprived, and I'm in agony, I'm in absolute pain, and I'm thinking to myself, God, why are you doing this to me? This is too much for any man to handle. And I get to the MRI machine, and they start putting metal plates on my head. And as they're doing this, I'm thinking to myself, could this get any worse? And they would do something else that would make it worse. And then I would just keep going through this, and I got to a point where I gave up, and I said, give me your worst. Give me your worst. There's nothing you're going to be able to do to make me stop loving God. There's nothing that's going to get in between my love of God. So bring me your worst. And then I was able to really deal with it by accepting it. Because I've learned that no one is above suffering, and no one is above pain. And the reason why you feel pain and suffering is because you think you don't deserve it. You avoid it. Again, that's the id. We're trying to avoid pain and suffering. But suffering gets rid of that. Suffering takes the self out of oneself. It takes the ego out of oneself. And then when you feel pain and suffering, you accept it, and you're able to carry a conversation with people, and they wouldn't even know that you're suffering. I've learned a lot through this whole process. I've been in this condition for 7 years now, and every day is just, there's there's more. There's just more. And my wife suffers with me. But we're waiting for God's works to be fulfilled, and I won't die until that happens. There was a time where, when I was in the hospital, you guys know what Code Blue is? Code Blue means like all hands on deck, right? Like, this guy is in bad shape, we're losing him. And that was on my way to a CT scan. It was a CT scan, is that what they call it? I'm not a doctor, obviously. So as I'm going to the CT scan, all of a sudden I start like losing it. And I kind of saw myself from the outside looking at me. And I'm watching these people pounding on my chest, and they're screaming and yelling and screaming my name, Michael, stay with us. And I remember just in myself smiling. Like, I'm not going to die. This isn't how I'm going to go out. I was so fearless that I knew what was happening. I couldn't tell the nurses and the doctors, don't worry, I'm going to be okay. But I knew I was going to be okay. Because God's work hadn't, it just doesn't make any sense that I would go out this way. So whatever you're feeling with your own suffering, learn from it. Embrace it. Don't avoid it. Accept it. You're not better than it. I think that's all I've got to say. But, we can pray now. I think it's time. Yeah, you. Let's stand up and pray. Make us, O Lord, worthy to say with thanksgiving, saying, Our Father who art in heaven, be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Through Christ Jesus our Lord.